Hi guys, so this is part 5 of our book Posted. I took a minute just to jot down some notes. I don't know if you can read it or not, but this just is talking about our main character. So we have Eric, who his nickname is the Frost, and then we have Wolf, Bench, and Dee Dee. We learned their real names and what they are known for in the book. So we'll go ahead and get started on part 5. I'm on page 34 now. It was just the two of us for a while. We didn't complete the tribe until the 6th grade fall field trip to Newaga State Park, the teachers trying to squeeze in some appreciation for Mother Nature before winter bit us in the butt. We ate lunch in the grass and then set out on a 2-mile trail, 98 6th graders following teachers like waddling ducklings. But Bench and I wandered off into the woods and got separated from everyone else. By the time we found our way back to the trail, the herd had moved on, so we set out on our own, keeping our ears perked for barking teachers until we ran into 2 other kids just as lost as we were. They introduced themselves as Advic and Morgan. We introduced ourselves as JJ and Frost. We agreed to stick together, working along the trails until we found the rest of the class. It only took 30 minutes, but in that 30, and in the 10 more of scolding from Principal Whittingham that followed, we clicked, just snapped together like Legos. I'm still not sure what it was about that day, that trip, that moment. Maybe it was the 4 of us daring each other to pee in the Muskogee River, or Bench climbing a tree and getting his undies snagged on a branch, or Dee Dee claiming to have found a print in the mud that he swore came from a velociraptor. Or maybe we all just kind of subconsciously realized that there was strength in numbers, that 4 was better than 2 and 2. We rode the bus together that afternoon, talking the whole way back to school about everything: favorite bands, lame movies, best video games, lousy parents, worst teachers, the smell on the bus, gasoline, damp leaves, sweat. The odd fact that we had never talked to each other before, even though we had a few classes together. How strange it was for us to get lost at the same time, to just run into each other in the woods like that. How Dee Dee's farts sounded like a dying baby elephant. How Principal Whittingham looked like he was going to pop when he found out the 4 of us had wandered off on our own. How none of us really liked our first names. I remember laughing hysterically and eating most of Dee Dee's goldfish crackers, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, feeling like I was part of something. The next day at lunch, we found each other and just picked up where we left off. Mom was right. You make your tribe. Sometimes I hate it when she's right, but not that time. Looking back on it, I think it had to be something like getting lost in the woods. Otherwise, we might have just gone on ignoring each other. I don't want to make it out to be some big, gooey, sappy thing. We didn't share the same pair of traveling pants or promise over spit shakes to be BFFs. We just kind of gloomed together. And we managed to stay that way for 2 whole years, just the 4 of us, pretty much perfect. Then she came along, and the war started, and everything came unglued. That first Monday after the cell phone crackdown, I went to my locker before 7th period to grab my Spanish notebook. Attached to the metal door above the combination was a sticky note, standard yellow, from one of the packs that every student was required to buy at the start of the year for no real reason whatsoever. It was from Dee Dee. "Welcome to the Dark Ages," it said. He didn't sign it, but I knew it was from him. No one else would be so melodramatic. That was the first one. The one that started it all, I guess. I folded it in half and dropped it in the bottom of my locker without a second thought. The variable. So, Frost. Dee Dee, Bench, Wolf, tribal names. All names we gave to each other. All except Frost. I was Frost before I ever met them. Words of advice: if you ever get the chance to win your 5th grade district-wide poetry competition, don't. Or if you do, try to keep it to yourself. Because sometimes things stick. Oh, I get why he's called Frost now for poetry. They attach themselves like burrs on your socks, and they follow you. Like that story your parents always tells your friends' parents at dinner about how you got into the pantry when you were 4 and ate a whole box of lemon jello, the raw powder, not the jiggly stuff, straight out of the package, turning your tongue bright orange and forcing them to call poison control. From that moment on, you know those people will never eat the stuff without laughing. You will forever be Jello Boy, in addition to all the other things you've become. More often, in school at least, it's a label thrown out on a whim, maybe, by some kid trying to get a giggle from the kid next to him. But then it's picked up on and passed around until it becomes a part of you. Kid who never brushes his hair. Kid whose crack is always showing. Kid with the giant schnoz. Kid who always gets picked last. Kid who blew chunks on stage. These are all real people, except I can't tell you most of their names. Even I know them only by what stuck. Except the kid who always gets picked last, that's Dee Dee. If you're lucky, or at least not terribly unlucky, the thing that sticks to you will just be a nickname, and not a pathetic one, like Frost. Ask most 12-year-olds kids to name a poet, and they will probably tell you Shakespeare, or Shel Silverstein, or Kendrick Lamar. Some of them will probably say Dr. Seuss, though, like my dad says, just because your stuff rhymes, it doesn't necessarily make you a poet. I don't imagine a whole lot of kids would tell you their favorite poet is Robert Frost. I'm probably the only one. I blame my father, in fact. He's the one who introduced us, me and Frost, on a tedious summer Sunday, a glass of wine in his hand, sitting across from me on the porch and handing me a copy of Frost Selected Poems. This was before the Sarasota Shuffle, the big split. Back when my parents tried to just ignore each other as much as possible, and I tried to ignore their ignoring. When the house would speak to us in creaks that we could hear because nobody else dared to speak because they were afraid of what they might say. We sat on the porch in the backyard, but my mother's bright fuchsia azaleas, just the two of us, the sun baking the grass. I think you're old enough, he said to me with a nod, and for a moment I thought he was going to hand me his glass for a sip. Instead, he gave me the book. Some dads take their kids fishing or play catch. My dad wrote for a living. Just my luck. I don't like poetry, I said, which wasn't entirely true then and certainly isn't now. When we did the 50-book challenge in the 4th grade, I was the only one who had a volume of poetry on my list, Jack Prelutsky. But the book my dad handed me wasn't anything like Jack Prelutsky. For starters, there was no illustrations, plus the cover looked kind of prissy, all blue and white flowers. I tried to hand it back, but my father just reached over and flipped it to a flap-cornered page. Start with this one, he said. It's one of his most famous. The poem was called The Road Not Taken. Dad told me to read it out loud. He wasn't the kind of father you said no to, not unless you wanted an hour-long lecture on the topic of things that are good for you. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, I began, and read it all, careful not to sound too bored so as not to offend my father, or too interested so as not to encourage him either. When I was finished, he asked me what I thought about it. I shrugged. Pretty good, I guess. Which is actually what I thought. I'd had to read worse stuff in school. I figured that was the end of it. It hadn't dawned on me that my dad might actually be interested in my opinion. But he told me to read it again, quietly, to myself. So I did. With him sitting across from me, looking out over the porch at the heavy clouds and grimacing at the birds and the maples, I read it again and again. And when I looked back up after the 3rd reading, he asked, "How does it make you feel?" I could feel his cloud-gray eyes on me. He wanted a real answer. He seemed to be holding his breath. "Guilty?" I said at last, though I wasn't sure why. That was just the first word that came to my mind. My dad reached over and scruffed my hair. "It's not guilt," he said. "It's regret. They aren't quite the same." He took another sip of wine and went back into the house, leaving me and Robert Frost on the porch. He moved out 3 months later. I read all 114 poems in the book that summer, most more than once. That next winter, with my father and mother still haggling on the phone about what to do at the house, that he didn't even live in anymore, I came home with an assignment to write something for the 13th annual Brenton School District Young Authors Competition. It could be a poem or a short story. You could illustrate it if you wanted. The winner would receive a medal and a $50 gift card to Barnes & Noble. I wrote a poem inspired by Frost's Mending Wall, my personal favorite of the 114. Frost's poem was about 2 guys who meet in the middle of a field to repair this broken old stone wall that separates their properties, and it has this line, Good fences make good neighbors, which the speaker of the poem thinks is totally crap. And yet he goes on and keeps building the fence anyways, and you kind of wonder why. What would happen if they left the wall broken or tore it down completely? Wouldn't they still be good neighbors? Would they maybe be better neighbors? Would they be something more like friends? My poem was called The Elf's Mischief, and it began, I am the thing that does not love a wall. It was about all those questions about broken walls and whether good fences ever made for good families too. Maybe it was because it wasn't another haiku lazily written in the back of the bus on the way to school, or maybe the teachers who were acting as judges had fence issues of their own, or divorced parents, or both, because I won. Pretty much the only time in my life I've won anything. The day after the award ceremony, my name was called over the morning announcements at school. The teacher made me show everyone the medal and then asked me to stand in front of the class and read the poem out loud. The other kids asked if they could have the gift card. Without even thinking, Mrs. Beck said, we now have our very own Robert Frost. Boom. That was it. One comment from my 5th grade teacher, and I became someone else, the junior poet laureate of Folsom County. That same night that I earned my new nickname, my mother drove me to Barnes & Noble's in Portage, about an hour away, to spend my reward. I bought her a Frappuccino and spent the rest on comic books. As we passed the sign welcoming us back to Brenton, sitting right in the middle of an empty field, I thought about my father and Sarasota and Frost and how there were actually a whole buttload of fences out in the world, but most of them were invisible. Deep thoughts for an 11-year-old, I guess, but reading Robert Frost all summer after your parents split will do that to you. When I got home, I called my father to tell him about my victory and what the kids were calling me at school, but he wasn't there. I didn't bother to leave a message. Okay, so I need you guys to head over to Schoology, and we are going to look at some of Robert Frost's poems, and we're going to try this on our own, see if we can do it. Okay, see you guys in a little bit.